All right. Okay, everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Welcome to the Popular Music Books and Process series. All events, save one this fall, are scheduled for Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can just email Francesca Royster, froyster at DePaul.edu to be added to the series email list and get Zoom links in the future. You can watch the video for all the presentations on Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel soon after the event happens, and you can see the event archives on the Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel. And you can find the whole calendar for the series on the IASPM US website under the Journals tab. The series is co-organized by Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and with me sitting in for Eric Weisbard this year, who is out of the country. Eric will join as often as he can, given the time difference overseas. This series is sponsored by the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. So next week we'll have, on September 26th, we'll have Jonathan Liao talking about his book, Dreams in Double Time, on Race, Freedom, and Bebop, published by Duke University Press, in conversation with Nate Sloan. But today we have Jesse Rifkin and Michael Tedder in conversation about the topic of vanishing spaces. And I'll briefly do both Michael's and Jesse's bio, and then I'll turn it over to you all. Michael Tedder is the author of Top 8, How MySpace Changed Music, published by Chicago Review Press in 2023. And so Michael Tedder has written about music, film, the entertainment industry, television, health, and masculinity for Esquire, Playboy, Money, The Street, The New Republic, Stereo Gum, Vulture, Variety, The Daily Beast, The Ringer, The Village Voice, and Mel. He is the former managing editor of the music magazine CMJ and the pop culture magazine Paper, and he was a founding editor of the critical discussion website, The Talkhouse. He co-founded the New York-based music critic reading series and podcast Words and Guitars. He lives in the New York metro area. Jesse Rifkin is the author of This Must Be the Place, Music, Community, and Vanished Spaces in New York City, published by HarperCollins in 2023. And for Jesse's bio, Jesse Rifkin is the owner and sole proprietor of Walk on the Wild Side Tours NYC, a New York-based music history walking tour, and works as a pop music historian at Alan Lomax Association for Cultural Equity. His writing has appeared in Noisy and The Quietest, and his work has been covered in the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, BBC Six, Interview, Hellgate, Alternative Press, and Folders Travel. He lives in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And just some housekeeping, place your questions in the chat, and Francesca will lead the Q&A after Jesse and Michael's conversation, and she will ask you to unmute and ask your question at that time. Also, you can use the chat for comments and discussion. And now I'll turn it over to Michael and Jesse. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really an honor to be here and to be doing this. Yeah, I don't know. I guess we figured we would just talk briefly about what our books are.
Okay.
Do you want to do it? Do you want me to do it first?
I think it's appropriate we are paired together because I have a book about a website, an entire digital ecosystem that's supporting music that doesn't exist anymore and basically vanished due to late capitalism, greed, things of that nature. Whereas Jesse's written a wonderful book about a bunch of venues that by and large don't exist anymore. And by and large, those venues disappear because of usually gentrification. That's probably 9 times out of 10. Right.
Yeah, in the broadest sense.
Yeah, so my book, Top 8, How MySpace Changed Music, is about blogs, MySpace. It centers around the emo boom, but I try to cover as much as possible about the musical ecosystem that surrounded MySpace during its prime years in the aughts.
Cool. And my book looks at, I guess, 60 years of different music communities in New York City, starting with folk in the 1960s and moving up through various scenes and genres up through Brooklyn in the 2000s and 2010s. And sort of looking at the way that these communities function geographically and economically, and their relationships with the neighborhoods that they called home. Both, what about those neighborhoods allowed them to flourish, and then what role they played in changing those neighborhoods and gentrifying those neighborhoods, which is, pretty much just happens over and over and over and over again in New York City.
Yeah. It's funny reading your book, Jesse. Very often it seems what happens is there is a new wave of young people, some fresh out of college, some otherwise. They're looking for something to do. They find a place where it's relatively cheap or there's space. They start a scene. And would you say that very often the people who live in the space before the young people showed up, they're not psyched?
Yeah. Biology, I don't know, one of the things that really struck me when I was working on the book was the story of CBGB, which is, this iconic punk venue, which was their landlord throughout their entire existence was basically a homeless shelter. And these shows were going late into the night, and there's people outside drinking and screaming and all of this outside this place where these people were trying to get a good night's sleep. And yet CBGB was they had openly said they had a fantastic relationship with the NYPD because they viewed the club correctly as this gentrifying force, that was gonna do whatever it was that the police were hoping they would do. So they're definitely not stoked.
Yeah, they're never like, oh great, there's hipsters here, things are going wonderful.
Right.
Or whatever they call hipsters in the 70s. I was struck by the stories of you're writing about the chapter about the anti-folk scene, how there were shows. I knew this, how there were shows in Tompkins Square Park. You say the Grateful Dead, but the neighborhood wasn't very happy about it. They would actually sometimes go to these shows and throw rocks at people.
Yeah, that was very much the case. And even as the scenes in that part of the East Village around Tompkins Square Park took root, there's a hardcore punk scene, which is mostly teenagers from the suburbs coming in and making a lot of noise, and kind of noise bands and other things like that. But as they're all sort of taking root in this neighborhood, they start getting a lot of noise complaints, not from new people that are coming in and gentrifying the neighborhood strictly, but from people who have been living there for decades, who are just furious that this stuff is, it's just being allowed to happen, especially in the park where they can just make noise all through the night.
I think I think the common connection between our books we sort of are about how music needs a space, because you have music itself, but music is great when music's at its best, or one of music's most noble purposes, I should say. One of music's most noble purposes is fostering a community around artists and fans, and music really needs that to thrive. And my book is about how that space was an online space. Yours is various physical spaces, but either way, music can't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah, it was actually really interesting to me reading your book, which I've loved.
Well, thank you.
There is one bit of overlap. Obviously, we're writing about very different things. But there's one anecdotal overlap, which is that we both interviewed Cassie Ramone from the band Vivian Girls. Told kind of the same story about how her band came together and found an audience because we were talking to her from different angles, she told the story in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
So there was this detail in your book that I didn't know about when I talked to her, which was that she had been actively combing MySpace, like learn what the social cliques were within the scene in Brooklyn, and then using that as like real world, information. And it was so interesting to me. I think it's really illustrative of the way that MySpace sort of bridged this gap between the internet and the real world, so to speak, rather than being like totally separate the way that so much of the internet maybe seems to be these
I
days.
was struck by that also. It's funny because I feel like the part of your chapter around Williamsburg, and I moved to Williamsburg around 2006, and it's a great vibrant scene. And as you would expect, a lot of those artists were like, and fans were very, very cool. Maybe a bit too cool for school, one could argue. But even them, even if you're the type of person who's inclined to be like, oh, MySpace is so corporate or this or that, or it's all only for teenagers, or Rupert Murdoch owns it, it was really hard to argue with the fact that MySpace was great for local or unsigned bands, DIY artists to find DIY house shows and book DIY tours. That's the thing that's always about MySpace. It was very, very corporate from the start, but it was also absolutely DIY at the same time. Like even Todd Patrick, the infamous or the famous DIY booker, even he used the website, which if Todd P is using it, you can't really know it had utility.
Well, it was really fun for me to read, because during this era that you're writing about, I was playing in, small scale bands and touring and what have you. And MySpace, like, I think of that era as the MySpace era because it was so valuable and such a dependable tool. I booked entire tours on MySpace. I made, I have like 20-year friendships that started on MySpace. It was this great place for bands to find each other and then like bring that relationship into the real world. It was like almost like a bulletin board or a town square or something. I was also kind of struck by the cycle of MySpace that you described sort of being very similar to the cycle of a lot of the music venues that I was writing about, especially something as, I'll lean on this example again, but something like CBGB, where it's this very, this kind of labor of love to some degree, but also a money-making enterprise. It gathers steam via small bands coming together, finding each other and making this work, and then bigger names kind of show up and jump on the bandwagon. It made me think of those ridiculous, I don't know if you've ever seen the ridiculous photos of Paul Simon trying to hang out with television at CBGB.
I think I have actually.
They're just absurd. Or like there was like a Shakira photo shoot that they did there. But just that, it becomes increasingly like through both bad business calls and imitators who kind of take the basic premise and make it a little more inviting and just diluting the brand, it all gradually collapses, which is just the cycle that you see over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's funny. From the Brooklyn chapter, I think it was DJ Olive. They said along the lines of It's weird to think that I do know Williamsburg was a place people went in the 90s. It's just kind of, if it was always weird to see that. It's like from 1990, 1995, that's where people decided to leave this alone because it's going to raise the property value. There's this grace period where it's just a free for all. Like every great scene, what do you think it has? Like 5 golden years, 7
if they're lucky
years. Yeah.
I mean, in some cases, it's just like a year, 2 years. It's funny, there's actually a plaque on the building that used to be the Mud Club. It's not put up by the city. It's this homemade, or not homemade, but this plaque that was just independently put up, that says the Mud Club 1978 to 1981, which is wrong. The Mud Club closed in 1983. But 1981 is when everybody stopped going.
Right.
Like that's when it ceased to be cool and just became this kind of embarrassing thing that no one was hanging out at anymore.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was probably not deliberate in that way, but yeah, I just think of the ways that these things inevitably become passe, and it's almost worse for them to stick around.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I shudder to think of what a club like Max's Kansas City would look like if it was still open today.
Yeah.
It would just be this like Hard Rock Cafe tourist trap
Right. But
situation.
it's funny with MySpace. People have asked me these sort of questions. On one hand, I think every artist or most artists I talk to wish it was still around because it's a really great place to meet your fans. And these days, we have a lot of online platforms. They're maybe good at one thing. Like you go over to YouTube over here, Instagram over here, Spotify over there, but the audience is all spread out. Whereas MySpace is functioning properly, you had it all in one place. People could go to your site, they could see who's in your top 8, what bands you were associated with, listen to your music, et cetera, et cetera. So on one hand, it'd be great if you still had something to use for the fans. But on the other hand, I think the reason MySpace has a level of nostalgia around it and around Tom Anderson is because like it didn't, MySpace maybe wasn't great at the end, but Tom Anderson has never been called before Congress for, not doing enough to curb white supremacy on his platform or possibly undermining state security. Like the fact that Tom Anderson didn't do those things, and I don't know, other tech CEOs did, means like maybe MySpace stopped at the right time.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess there was a point where they stopped letting you approve your followers and all that stuff. It got kind of silly, I guess. But yeah, Tom had some degree of integrity the entire time. And actually thinking about the subject of top 8s, because that was like the biggest thing for me playing in a band. Like the way I was booking these tours was just looking at other bands' top 8 friends, and then finding those people, and then those people and those people and those people. But there are analogs in these these earlier scenes that I write about, places like the Folklore Center in Greenwich Village in the 60s, or the Mud Club, where they had these walls of photos of who the big names in the community were, almost as a way to let outsiders know, if you're coming in. Like the Folklore Center was very much a center for the scene. It was almost like real life MySpace. You could meet other people there, musicians, itinerant musicians got their mail there. You would learn who was a big deal. You would see gigs advertised. You could buy, anything you might need to go out and do it yourself. This very, I don't know, community oriented and kind of DIY thing. Not that MySpace necessarily is DIY, but it worked as a tool in that way.
Yeah, it was a tool you could use towards DIY purposes, or really whatever purpose you wanted.
Yeah. One of the other interesting things that your book made me think about is you talk about sort of what happens when other social media sites come in and sort of usurp MySpace's role, and they're less media focused, and it's sort of it almost becomes this thing where it's the end of music listeners turning to specific scenes, specific music as a way of defining themselves, as this identity, and it becomes more diffuse. And similarly, I think like as music became that way and migrated online in this way, the culture of music fandom, gets watered down. And so it's funny, geographic scenes very much still exist,
right?
But they don't get defined that way. There's less of a music press like you talk about and whatnot. But it's funny. Like I was talking to somebody recently, and they were saying, oh, I see great bands coming out of New York City, but there's no scene really. I was like, oh, what are the bands? And then they listed all these bands that like played shows together, all know each other. It's all very much a scene. But because it isn't presented that way, it doesn't register really in same capacity. And it made me wonder if maybe that's sort of why you don't see the musicians themselves playing the same kind of outsized role in gentrification that they once did.
Mhm.
You know, clubs are still very much kind of beacons for gentrification, but in terms of who's making the music and where they live, that seems to be at least not nearly as central as it used to be as an issue.
I agree with that. I definitely feel that streaming and the model economy we have at the moment has, I don't want to say devalues music, because music is like precious to me. It's like one of the most important things. But in the marketplace, which I saying those words makes you go, ugh, it
Right.
certainly has been devalued.
Yeah, if this is a dollar amount on it.
Yeah. And I definitely feel like culture, the way culture is these days, is just a lot of emphasis on a handful of top artists. And I'm not dissing these artists, by the way. They got there usually because they're pretty great. And then it's a free for all for like to get attention for the rest of the 99%. And therefore, it's harder than ever to get people to focus around like, here's a handful of artists. You haven't heard of them, but they're actually worth your time. And they're in this area. And there was a time the media was very good at bringing attention to that, for better or for worse. And these days, there's not enough media, and people's attention spans are too distracted. And it's hard never to find these places because they're so expensive. But I don't give up. I'm always of the opinion that whenever people think, oh, music's dead, rock's dead, punk's dead, hip hop's dead, New York's dead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's around the moment when you're about to get hit with another wave, which few were probably due for.
Well, there's also, as I noted in the introduction of my book, whenever I would talk to people about, you know, these scenes, these eras they were involved in, and then ask them like when the scene died, when New York, you know, when things ended for New York City as this culturally vibrant place. And like across the board, it was when they entered their mid-30s.
Right. It's kind of
You know, it was like there's no one answer. Everybody thinks they got there for the last great decade.
Mm-hmm.
And then just like coincidentally, around the time they, you know, get more demanding jobs and have kids and, you know, lose interest in their tastes kind of calcify, the vision becomes much narrower in that, where you have to work very hard to not have it be narrow.
Yeah.
I certainly find myself working very hard to have it not be narrow.
Yeah.
But I lost my train of thought.
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
It's funny. Changing topics a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be safe to say that the Brooklyn chapter is probably the main scene you experienced in real time as a music fan?
Yeah, that and the anti-folk scene.
Okay.
Although the anti-folk stuff I experienced, but I wasn't really a participant in. Not that I would go so far as to say I was a participant in the Brooklyn scene. But you know, those are the venues that I was playing at the time. That's where I was hanging out. I saw a lot of this stuff happen in real time, and I had to really try to check my own nostalgia and my own preferences at the door writing about it. Because, you know, there were venues that were really important and I just never had a good time there.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
But yeah, that was very much what I lived through. And part of the reason that I wanted the book to cover as broad a time frame as it did, and to get into the, you know, the 21st century and music in the city, is to sort of make this case that there's always something happening. There's always a way forward. And even after Manhattan becomes totally, or Lower Manhattan becomes totally inaccessible to working artists, that, you know, that doesn't mean that it was the end. And it always sort of bugged me that all these previous scenes and eras all sort of get described as like the golden era,
right,
in New York City, and it's it loses all meaning. And to try to show them that like this thing that was happening that I was around for, that I know you were around for as well, was just as thrilling to be around and be a part of, and just as vibrant. And the music that came out of it is, a lot of it is music I still love and still really cherish. And
Yeah,
it just, yeah.
it's funny. Struck by fact, close to a decade ago, I wrote a feature article for Stereo Gum about how it seemed like Philadelphia was becoming like the epicenter of rock in 2010s, because you had things like modern baseball, the war on drugs being the big one, Kurt
Right.
Vile, but also like Strain of Oaks, like folky classic rock bands and also punk bands.
Yeah.
And I always kind of felt like New York had a hard time admitting to itself that like we've driven all the artists out of town and now they're going to Jersey and Philadelphia. Like, it's just not something we could really reconcile with. I still feel like we're having a
Yeah.
hard time dealing with that. Like, if artists can't afford to live in New York and make the culture vibrant, then why are we paying all these high rents to live in New York?
Yeah. I mean, it's all, just as an aside, it's funny that you mentioned Strand of Oaks specifically, because Tim is somebody that I met on MySpace
Oh yeah, nice.
and played shows with as a direct result of us having met that way. But yeah, I mean, the city becomes more and more expensive, obviously, but there's ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of what people maybe forget when we talk about these narratives from the past is that, like, when Talking Heads were forming and playing their early shows, they were not living in like a 2-bedroom apartment. They were living in a big empty floor of an abandoned factory building. Or
Yeah.
it wasn't abandoned, actually. The other floors of the building had factories that would close at 5 o'clock, and after 5 o'clock, they'd shut the power off, or not the power. They would shut the heat off and the hot water. And it's pretty hard living, but like it can be done. I
Yeah.
remember a few years ago, guy that I was in a band with was living in this like wildly illegal converted garage with something like 25 other people who all
Mm-hmm.
had these little cubicles. And um it was really, I couldn't do it, but I was sort of amazed that it existed. It was right in the heart of like the most gentrified part of Bushwick.
Yeah.
You know, these things can be done. You have to look a little harder for them, maybe.
Mm-hmm. It's
Um,
funny. Uh, Recently I watched a documentary about the Elephant Six recording company.
oh, I watched that too.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
it was great.
And like any scene just kind of naturally peters out to an extent. And you definitely, no one said this out loud, but the reason that scene was so vibrant was because you had people who in their early 20s or mid 20s were willing to live in a group house with like 9 people, pay almost no rent, and make music all day, which is great. But so many people, you hit your 30s, you're like, fine, I'll get a job. I can't have 8 roommates anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I was actually having this conversation last night with somebody. We were talking about, why all these venues closed. Um, and it was this guy that was a booker at the Silent Barn, which is this Brooklyn club where I spent a lot of time, or technically it was in Queens.
Mm-hmm.
But he was saying, if you look at all of these clubs that I talked about in the book, really very few of them are actually shuttered directly by um, the police or even by landlords. They're closed because of burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And it just is this very, very difficult uphill battle to run a venue, especially like a small scale DIY, maybe not totally legal, very slim margins venue. And it's just
Yeah.
over and over and over again. It's people do it because they have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a recipe for just totally burning out
Yeah.
inevitably.
It's funny because like I feel MySpace and the 2000s in general was when we started to really have like music scenes became online. Like we had that to an extent in the 90s, but you just had to really know the right message board, which became just a lot easier in the 2000s. And I still think we have online spaces and offline spaces to this day, but I do think the online spaces, be that TikTok fan groups, private Discord servers, this and that, they do seem to be thriving a bit more these days than the offline spaces.
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard for offline spaces to thrive these days, for any number of reasons. I know like the spaces in New York that are thriving now are dance music venues, for the very simple reason that clubs make more money if they have a DJ, because people stay for longer and they go to the bar the whole time.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what can survive now, in the city.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like so often, while gentrification isn't the only reason a club or a scene like vanishes, it's very often culprit number one.
Yeah. And there was actually an interesting link that I was thinking about between our books, because one of the things that really happened, very tangibly happened in the MySpace era, is that I think people who were doing this stuff, who were really involved in like this DIY underground culture, didn't really consider what implications putting information about DIY shows on MySpace might have. And every realtor in New York City was looking at that. You know, landlords were looking at that. People knew exactly what was happening. And, you know, especially once Facebook came along and people started doing like Facebook events, and you could see how many people were ostensibly coming.
Yeah.
And it was just, we were just handing this information over, to real estate interests, like publicly. And so the stuff I see now that really thrives in the city, very deliberately doesn't put all the information online. And there's always been stuff like that, and you know, to some degree it's definitely an affectation, sometimes anyway, but you know, for things to exist at this point, you need that kind of like stricter gatekeeping and that kind of privacy.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. Like on one hand, online spaces are great because they make things very accessible. They get rid of the gatekeeping. It's like if you're not from a cool city, if you didn't go to a cool college or have a cool friend, you can still find out about this stuff and get into it. And that's wonderful. Music should be for everyone. But you're right. It does make it easier for bandwagon jumpers, for people to misuse this access. It's always a tension.
Yeah. It's funny. I think maybe the single most, I'm not going to say important, but like one of the most resonant lyrics that I've heard in the year 2023, is from that band The Dare, who are, you know, this kind of goofy electronic thing. But there's this line, I'm at the club and you're online.
Yeah.
I'm in the city and you're online. Like the brag is not being online.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I think that's just so great. I think that's so indicative of where we're at, with scenes, with the culture at large. Just like, that's the coolest thing you can possibly do now, is not use the internet.
Yeah. I mean, I think every couple of years there's a trend piece in the New York Times about like 20 somethings who don't have iPhones, they have dumb phones. It's like, I get that, but at the end of the day, it is actually really convenient to have that GPS.
Yeah. These are the trade-offs that we make, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of keeping an eye on the time too. But are we good to keep going, or should we move to other people's questions? It's like 5:40-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's still time if you all want to keep going for a little bit. You could probably Q&A maybe 10 minutes or so.
Sure. Okay.
So I'm sorry, you go first.
No, go ahead.
To what extent does where a genre, like, okay, so what extent does genre play, or what's it actually a better question? What is the difference between a space and a genre. Like, if there is a scene, is it kind of known like if you don't play this sort of music, you just shouldn't like be involved in the scene whatsoever. Like, say around the 2000s, hip hop was bigger than ever, and there was a thriving backpacker rap scene. You had people like Aesop Rock, Atmosphere. But as much as Williamsburg was having these DIY indie rock punk shows, like I don't really remember there being like a lot of like rap shows around the same time in that scene, just because it seemed like, I'm not saying that no one ever said they weren't welcome. It's just that they naturally just gravitate that way.
Yeah. I mean, I remember there being some like there was a while where that group Ninja Sonic seemed to be on like every Todd P.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it's funny too, and this is just sort of my conjecture, but the thing that's really unique about Manhattan specifically is that it's so geographically small.
Right.
You can get from the westernmost point to the easternmost point in like, I don't know, half an hour. You can walk the entire length of the island in like 3 hours. It's, it, at least for the 20th century, it built up rather than out. And so there's all of this cross-pollination because people are almost forced to encounter other kinds of people and other kinds of sounds and other, just other things just going about their lives. And all of this stuff is kind of piled on top of everything else, like I was always really struck me that the Loft, David Mancuso's big private dance party, was right around the corner from the band Suicide's practice space in Soho. That kind of proximity, I think, really feeds into something. And then that was then another block away from Ornette Coleman's house, where he had a venue in his place.
That's crazy to think about.
Yeah. And Brooklyn is not that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Brooklyn is, like twice the size, half as many trains. And, even just within a scene, people are less geographically centralized.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the matter of it being, a more expensive city to live in now. People need jobs and things that take up a lot of their time, and they're not walking around in the same way and just kind of taking it all in and having other sounds that they would never have heard in their lives, enter into their view. And that changes things, and I think it makes it a lot worse.
I think so too. Awesome.
Yeah. Like with the, there were a lot of clubs, and I think because of that proximity, that geographic proximity, a club like Tonic, which was on the Lower East Side in the 90s, was this big hub for avant-garde music, for jazz, for sort of more underground hip-hop stuff, and ambient, and for indie rock. It was this extraordinary place, and musicians were hanging out there. They were always comped, and all kind of knew each other. And you get these sort of very unlikely friendships coming out of that. Like, I know Matthew Shipp, the jazz musician, became friendly with Sean Marshall from Cat Power.
Yeah.
Just from them both being around Tonic, and now those scenes, there's still plenty of places for them to play, for all of those different kinds of artists, but it's not the same place. They're more spread out. They're more defined, I think, genre-wise. A place like Issue Project Room or whatever is never gonna book an indie band. And there's I think a lot of geographic factors in there.
It's just kind of funny because like so much of the story of the last, I don't know, the 21st century maybe in general, especially the last 10 years, is the middle class of everything, just middle class in this country of people, but also like the middle class of like websites and artists just keeps getting squeezed more and more and more. These days, like, we have like a handful of really huge websites, but most of the advertising money goes like Facebook and Google. So it's hard ever to like have like a thriving blog that maybe doesn't make a ton of money, but you can make a living working at it, or like a small website. We have a few, but it's tougher than ever just because there's just not much money going around anymore. Whereas in the aughts, there was like a ton of them.
Right.
And I mean, obviously there's still small venues, but very often the realtor is like, well, I could like rent out this loft to some bookers and they'll do shows, but I don't know, I'll sell it. I'll get more money if like there was a bank or a CVS.
Well, that was I think to some degree Todd P, who we were talking about, is sort of responsible for that. At least in part, because Todd, the thing that really made Todd stand out is that he was, rather than having a venue, he was booking shows just all over the place in these very unlikely spots. I remember going to a couple shows he did in like a canvas tent on a construction site in industrial Greenpoint.
Oh, I missed that one. Sounds fun.
Yeah, Uncle Paulie's, it was called.
Oh, wait, that a pizza parlor, right? Yeah,
that's Paulie G's.
Oh, never mind. Sorry.
I think, but yeah, no, he was just this tent where like the construction workers were eating lunch during the day, and Todd was putting on shows there at night.
Cool.
And so the brand becomes the guy, not the venue.
Yeah.
You know, in previous eras, it was very much the venue and not the guy. You know, you wouldn't know necessarily who it was that owned Danceteria.
Right.
But if you were at a Todd P show, it was because it was a Todd P show. And that, I think, I don't know, I'm sort of forming this thought in real time as we're talking about it, but it maybe kind of reflects this kind of move in this era to like the personal brand, and, you know, things being more things being less about physical space and less about community in that way, and more just like, follow me, follow me, follow me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, a half-formed thought, but
yeah, it's funny because I get, you know, I doubt Todd P really wanted like this cult of personality around him, but like you said, like you have to follow, you know, the online world just kind of forces you to play with that, even if you don't really want to.
Well, Todd was at the vanguard of that. He had his own website. He had a mailing list that he updated regularly. I think there was a cult of personality degree there that he was kind of working. But at the same time, Todd was the only person in New York City putting on all ages shows, like at that with that regularity and at that small scale. And it coincides with NYU expanding and a lot more young underage kids coming into the city and looking for things to do.
Yeah.
It just, you know, the music in the city, the underground in the city would have looked incredibly different without him doing that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot worse. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting too. I liked in the book that you kind of talked about the ascent of Pitchfork being sort of simultaneous to the ascent of MySpace. Because that was this other thing. I mean, if we're talking about that era in New York City, where like this website that, you know, just sort of it didn't feel very real world, which is I think why they were able to be so snarky a lot of the time. It was just like, you know, throwing shit on the internet, but it would have very, very tangible real world consequences in these scenes in New York City,
for good and for ill.
Yeah, exactly. Like bands would blow up overnight, careers would be ended overnight. And, you know, you would really see the direct connection there. And I wonder if anything like that exists these days. Maybe not.
I don't think there's any one website that has the power to kill a band overnight anymore. But I still believe that, like, you know, a good write-up can kind of help a band. Like the right
Mhm.
the right place or the right recommendation. Like, yeah, it's still helpful, but I don't think it's like, boom, you're huge
Right.
anymore. I think that stuff is probably faded.
But it's also harder to kill the band's career off,
Yeah, of course.
which is, yeah,
Probably for the
maybe
best.
a net positive.
Right.
Yeah. As I mean, again, it sort of ties in perfectly to MySpace. I remember there was that band, uh, Black kids who got
Mhm.
best new music. Their MySpace page got best new music on Pitchfork.
Yeah. They were,
And they, right.
yeah.
They like
Long
blew
story
up.
short, I wrote like,
Yeah.
the first draft of my book was pretty close to 1,000 pages because I was also
Yeah.
like covering the blogosphere in general.
As was mine.
I'm working on a follow-up book, which will be more about the history of like indie.
Mhm.
But yeah, I talked
Yeah.
to my kids at length, and Mark Richardson, very nice man, the editor for Pitchfork, the editor of Pitchfork in the aughts, managing editor, I should say. He said,
Mhm.
yeah, this is the first time we ever reviewed a band's MySpace page, just because we
Yeah.
heard "I'm not going to teach my boyfriend how to dance with you," just knew it was a great song, still is. But then
Yeah,
like,
well, and then they got signed to a label and put out an album, and the Pitchfork review was just a meme of a sad puppy that said, "We're sorry."
yeah,
And that like ended their career like
basically. And
that.
Richardson did say like he was never a huge fan of the way that went down. He has some regrets.
Yeah.
But I talked to Reggie Youngblood, the lead singer of that band. He
Mhm.
says, yeah, the problem was like they wrote the song, they had the hit, they had like a viral hit, and they're pressured to get in the studio and make an album as soon as possible. While they were still doing a lot of tour dates. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's not a bad album actually, but it's definitely is
No,
like they could have taken a
I
little
liked
more
it.
time and done it more organically. But there was the era, things were happening really fast.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what do you
cool.
think,
I don't know, should we take
Michael and Jesse? Are you wanting to segue to some questions? Do you
yeah,
feel
I think so. It's a
it's like
good time to do that.
a
Yeah.
flow? Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, and as someone in the
Thank
Midwest,
you.
also really
Thank
terrific.
you.
So our first question is actually from Antonia.
Hey y'all, thank you for this great conversation. I had a really basic question, which is about a parallel, if any, between MySpace and Bandcamp. Because you talk about how corporate MySpace was, but people were able to find new groups that way and created a scene that way. And Bandcamp is designed to expose people to music, but I wonder if Bandcamp has taken over the role of MySpace in any way, or could you talk about that parallel?
I would agree with that. I don't think it has quite the reach or like quite the scale of MySpace, but I think you're definitely right. It's tough to say because so many genres, basically all genres, are represented on Bandcamp. But I do believe you can draw a really big parallel to it's hard to say, but I definitely think that Bandcamp is really responsible for the explosion of a new generation of like hardcore and punk bands. Like, because a lot of bands just put a dip up there, and like they're playing huge hardcore festivals like FYF or Hellfest or Sound and Fury. And obviously, hardcore and post-hardcore are having a moment because of the band Turnstile, who like were a band that were on Bandcamp. But you had so many bands these days, like Gouge Away, Rid of Me, Fleshwater, Scowl. And just as MySpace had all the genres, like every genre was represented on MySpace, in the popular imagination, it's still heavily connected to emo, just because that was the youth culture that started to surge at the time, and those fans were already heavily online when MySpace started, so they all kind of congregated over there. I've always argued that Dashboard Confessional were the first band to break off of Napster, just because people kept downloading that album and like giving it to their friends on CDRs. So emo was already ready to go when MySpace arrived. Whereas I think in the 2010s, there was this kind of a hunger for music that stood apart from like this had not knocking anything, but like indie rock and other forms of music had gotten kind of on the mellow side, very vibey, if you will. So I think kids, as they often did, wanted something more angrier, more cathartic, and a lot of that stuff just kind of moved to Bandcamp, that's where people started looking for the angry stuff, the heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But
I also wonder, or
yeah,
no,
no,
go
but that
ahead.
just might be my perspective though.
Yeah. I was also just thinking, like what we were talking about before in terms of this idea of scenes no longer really being publicly defined. You know, MySpace very, very, very much did define a community. Like you would look at a band and you would see what their community was, and Bandcamp really does not do that. You know,
Yeah.
people can recommend albums, but it's very easy to miss.
Mhm.
And I wonder if Bandcamp, just the way that it's set up, I don't know, sort of influences that gradual whittling away of context.
Yeah, I do really like the fact that with Bandcamp, you are encouraged to actually like spend money and support an artist.
Yeah.
I wish more outlets would do that, because one thing, like, artists need to make a living or also have to get real jobs and not make art.
Which is a real job.
Yeah,
It should be treated as a real job. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great answer to that question about paying the artist. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, my own question was about kind of for both of you, but really kind of inspired by Jesse's title, the ways that nostalgia and mourning and kind of loss or temporarity, maybe not temporarity, might be built into the sounds or the songs that that you were writing about. And I realized that you are both writing about a pretty big span of music, but were there some songs or bands that really stood out in terms of kind of foregrounding the way that nostalgia might be built into the scenes?
I mean, I guess less than specific songs, the thing that really struck me that way were the artists that had really long, really diverse careers. You know, there were people that I talked to who started out in the glam rock era who ended up becoming house music DJs in the 80s, and almost their defiance against nostalgia kind of highlighted the way so much succumbs to nostalgia, I guess. Was that did I answer the question? Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I wrote about a website and a scene that doesn't exist anymore, but it's just kind of funny how at some point collectively people went, you know who was great was My Chemical Romance. Man, I miss emo. And now you have stuff like Emo Night all over the place. You have the When We Were Young festival last year, headlined by Michael Romance. This year, I was also headlined by Paramore. This year, I think Fall Out Boy's playing. And some of those bands are better than others, but so much of that scene that's now being re-embraced, because I think it's a lot of people, they're older, they have kids, they want to relive their wayward youth. But also, so much of the way music moves forward is you have a generation of kids who are like, well, this isn't fair. I'm like 20. I wasn't there when Nirvana was big. I wasn't there when the Ramones were big, or My Chemical Romance was big, or the Strokes, or whatever the thing they felt they missed out on. And so many people are like, well, if that's not around anymore, I'm gonna have to find my own thing. So either I'll form a band, or I'll manage my friend's band, or I'll just go to these venues and see if I can find anything that's cool, or I'll go online. Like, this kind of the story of music is young people. One of the stories of music is young people like, well, I missed out on everything, so now I just have to find it on my own. And you attempt to like recreate this golden thing that you maybe not even really exists, maybe it just really exists in your mind, this weird nostalgia for something you didn't experience, but you get it through like music magazines, documentaries, music videos. And somehow in trying to recreate that, but also adding, you know, everyone puts in people themselves and reacts to the time that they're in now and whatever tools are around. Sometimes that's MySpace, sometimes it's other things. You get something new. And we see that every generation. It's actually one of the things that keeps music fresh. And, you know, it's hard to say right now, but I definitely think we're seeing Generation Z in their own way, kind of trying to reclaim like emo culture and alt rock culture and hardcore, but making it into something new and more positive, more inclusive in a way that I think is really beautiful.
Yeah. There's also just piggybacking on that. I was having this conversation recently that, it really gets me when people are like, oh, pop music now is so terrible. Like there's so much terrible music. There wasn't any terrible music back in the day. That's not true.
Yeah.
Like there's always terrible music. I don't think the real heads in the 60s were listening to Herman's Hermits, but as time goes on, this stuff becomes rebranded as nostalgic or as camp. And, these things that you hate, you end up loving because they remind you of an earlier time. And so it's, I don't know, it's just a funny way to think about all this old music through that sort of lens of nostalgia, that the quality judgments definitely get impacted by it.
Yeah. By it. There's a song that you think is super cringe when you're like young and cool, then later you're like very happy when you hear it at CVS.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem like commercial spaces seem to have something to do with it, or even like hearing things on commercials that can change your relationship to old music or t-shirts or etc. So thank you. Thanks. Okay, Rob. Rob Drew has a question for us.
That
was a really great discussion. And my question was about, I teach media studies, so Nancy Bain, among a number of others in my field, have talked a lot about how musicians now have to spend so much time, or feel they have to spend so much time interacting with fans online. And there's a lot of emotional labor involved. So I'm wondering if Michael thinks MySpace played a role there.
Yes, 100%, for better or for worse. I think some artists are naturally great at connecting with their fans. They're gregarious. They love talking to people. They love being able to like hear that instant feedback. They love having community around them. And like usually people who do that, the smart ones realize it's not about me as a person. It's just about the kind of community that is around my songs, my art. I'm only just a kind of a vessel for it. But some people make it all about themselves, and usually that doesn't end very well. But there's other musicians, God bless them, who like, that's not who they are. And that's totally fine. Like Julian Casablancas, he did not have a MySpace page. That's not a guy who would like ever message his fans or respond to a DM. He just wanted more mystique, and it worked for him. Some people can pull mystique off very well. Other people, it's not really their strong suit. But yeah, I do think MySpace was the beginning of artists having to put forth, and again, I'm sorry, a brand. Like even the top eight right there was like, here are the bands we are associated with. Here's people we tour with. Here are our friends. And well, on one hand, it was like a very like organic thing, like, hey, here's our buddies, here's our friends. It also was, you were defining your band. Say, okay, so you have 8 very collegiate indie rock bands in your top 8. We get your vibe right away. Or you have 8 dance pop acts. Great. We know exactly who you are. We know where we're situated. And yeah, like, and some bands on MySpace were like, write these really funny blogs. It got them a lot of attention. Lily Allen, she wrote great songs, but Lily Allen's blog on MySpace was like a must read back in around 2005, 2006. Really wish I could have interviewed her, but I tried. So yeah, definitely, to answer your question, MySpace was the beginning of that. Like, you have to work that. You have to work the audience that way. But there was a person I interviewed in the book, Nate Henry. He was a band called Sheerwood. They started off like with a really kind of cool Beach Boys, Beatles-esque vibe. And then they went to, and this is his own words, a very 2007 Warped Tour MySpace sound. They're trying to chase Fall Out Boy. And their whole thing was, when they're trying to make it big as a band, every member of the band would go to the computer lab, or later this would be on their laptop, going through people's MySpace pages, be like, hey, you like pop punk, you like our band. Hey, you like Blink-182, you like All American Rejects, you like our band. And they would like go to the mall, be like, hey, you're wearing a band t-shirt, listen to our band. And Nate Henry later said, like, we hustled really hard to find an audience, but we should have just take that time written better songs. because by the time we got the attention, the songs just weren't there. So there's a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for a great question.
Carl, your question on gentrification.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you.
So many thoughts come as a result. But one of the things that strikes me when we talk about gentrification's relationship to music is that, you know, and Jesse, in your work, I think it shows up kind of clearly, and maybe talking about it online would be another way to spin it, is that I think the makeup of scenes changes as a result too. It's not just the question of venues and all of these things, it's also who is on the scene. And you know, if you compare New York in the 70s and 80s to New York in the 2000s, you really conspicuously saw like a higher presence of clear, like kind of trust fund kids and people with that kind of background that enabled them to, you know, be able to deal with the fact that real estate was such a barrier to being able to get spaces and that kind of thing. And of course, there are ways around that, as you were saying, but a lot of the ways around that involve like, you can't be in Manhattan anymore. So, you know, and we've seen the same thing, I would say, in like visual arts as well. You see the shift to like kind of, you know, a generation of artists who now all have like Yale MFAs, and they're not, you know, it's really conspicuously a less working class accessible field than it once was. And of course, there were always rich kids around. I'm not saying it's like just because of this, but all of that has an effect on the art itself and that kind of thing. So I'm just interested in hearing you guys, and, you know, maybe there's a way of talking about it in terms of tech as well, and what tech, you know, having access and fluidity with the tools of tech, how that changes who is able to succeed in online spaces. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear you reflect on that.
Well, one of the really big things I think that the tech did for arts scenes is that it made it a lot easier. Social media made it a lot easier to find out who people's parents were, and what their backgrounds were. You know, these music scenes were always full of trust fund kids. Like the downtown, these scenes that are doing the gentrifying, it was over and over and over. A lot of people, you know, like Lou Reed was getting help from his parents.
Right.
Arthur Russell's parents were paying his rent. Like it was a lower rent, but still. But yeah, you know, as the city changes, it obviously becomes much, much harder for people who don't have those independent means to enter into these scenes. And the ones that do, and the way that they're able to do it, is by just working their asses off, you know, which I think doesn't necessarily make the music worse, but it hurts the musicians. It makes burnout that much more inevitable.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like funny. I think it was around 2010s we started hearing the phrase millennial burnout, but burnout's been around for a long time, but we didn't really use those. We didn't use that terminology until very recently. But yeah, there's always been what we would now call Nepo babies. Like, I love the Strokes, bunch of Nepo babies, but hey, they still wrote This Is It, right? Joe Strummer, he has literally a diplomat son. So none of this is new, but we are a lot more aware of these things. It's like we're a lot more aware of things, but we don't necessarily know how to process it or sometimes change it. It seems to be one of the defining issues of our modern times. We're hyper aware of everything. What can we really do about it? Yeah, but the way it's funny, if there is a town where like there's a lot of tech money, I don't know if the art around that town will be any good, because there might be a lot of people who like have money to throw around at this or that, but the scene around there would kind of will very naturally be let's just kind of service the interest of like these rich donors rather than trying to make cool stuff for ourselves. Like I can't really think of like any like tech area that's really produced like interesting music. But I could be completely off about that. But yeah, I do think the way technology though is one thing that was great about MySpace was it kind of happened around the same time that like nearly anyone could make music on their laptop, be it they're making homemade beats, which the cool kids did, or you're just kind of recording an acoustic guitar straight to your laptop, which so many artists did. You post it right there, and you get and you know sometimes people posted a song, and they got like a record deal like within the next couple of days, or Tom Anderson himself DM'd someone, or a song went viral. But the problem with that is like on one hand, it moves a lot faster, but it's also pretty good for an artist to have some time away from the spotlight to actually learn how to perform live and do this or that. So there were so many people who got famous on MySpace, like the Black kids, arguably before they should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That also just made me think of something, which is, you talk about like suddenly everybody having, or not everybody, but everybody with a computer having access to recording equipment. And I think it's really notable in the city now that has been a somewhat democratizing force, in that you no longer need to rent a practice space or keep buying guitar strings or whatever to make music. And the stuff that you see or the stuff that you hear really thriving in the city is inevitably music that people can make at home on a computer. Increasingly less organic and more synthetic, which I don't say judgmentally, but just the economics dictate the kind of music that gets made.
Yeah, I'm looking at the comment section here. Oakland obviously is definitely a town that has like that dichotomy between tech money, but also like the DIY art scene. Like I reviewed EMA for the book, but that'll become part of the other book. And she talked to me about like, yeah, they have these really gnarly noise rock shows, but like you go like 15 minutes over and it's like these really, really ritzy, rich places, which have like no place to play at all. And just kind of like a much different vibe. Yeah, Oakland would be a great example of like the tension there. So thank you for that comment, Nina. But yeah, it's funny though, the way technology, it's funny. This only happened very recently, but like someone who would have done gangbusters on MySpace is like one of the biggest rock artists in the world right now is Zach Bryan. He got his start just posting songs, recording songs to his iPhone memo, posting up YouTube videos. And as people have pointed out, maybe you love Zach Bryan, maybe he's not your thing. But people said, this guy is basically MySpace era emo, like Bright Eyes or Dash Professional, filtered through the spectrum of like Heartland rock. So it's like Dash Professional with some John Cougar Mellencamp and a light sprinkling of, I don't know, Travis Tritt or Dwight Yoakam or whatever, which is all like a combination that seems to be working very well for the man. So, and if he had been around in the early aughts, he would fit right in on MySpace. It would have been no problem whatsoever.
Wow. Okay, Nina actually had some great comments in terms of the pandemic as a context.
Yeah. Maybe you all can help me sort of form this into a question. I was kind of thinking both like of the interesting thing about digital and physical spaces as we just experienced this pandemic and how that affected our ability to gather in physical spaces and the expectations we have now coming out of it for how digital and physical live, expectations of streaming. But yeah, I would just, I don't know, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have about that.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I did an article recently for The Ringer about there's been like a really wave of explosion of bands from after Turnstile broke big. They're kind of hardcore, but they're also just kind of like plain old alternative rock. Like there's bands that they're technically hardcore, but they basically like play power pop, like the band Daisy, or there's band Scowl, who just sound kind of like what if Phoebe Bridgers fronted Hole? And what happened was I talked to this guy, Sunny Singh. He has one of the best YouTube pages called Hate 666. He just records videos of hardcore shows. Basically, any genre, any style of hardcore. You can be like a huge band like Turnstile or like a baby band playing their first show. And he's posted them online. There's close to 1,000 live shows on his page, I'd say. And he was saying, like, yeah, so he's been doing it for a while. I said, yeah, around 2017, 18, I'd see the same faces, you know, like older people, older heads, which is great and all. But there weren't any like younger kids. There weren't any younger bands. And I was just getting really worried that like the scene would dry out without that new blood. And then when shows came back to the pandemic, there were so many people who like, you know, were just grateful they could see live music again. But there's so many young people who are cooped up inside, wondering what was going on in the world, feeling like the world was ending, feeling like their leaders will let them down. They had a lot of angst and anger. And as soon as those shows came back, it just exploded. Like I was seeing all these new bands, all these new kids. It's more diverse in terms of gender, race, sexuality than I've ever seen it. It was just so wonderful to see. And like the amount of like younger people he is seeing at hardcore, punk, emo, whatever you want to call it, it's all kind of like rock and roll, really. Shows is like 10 times what it was. So I do think the pandemic just made people miss live gatherings. And I'll admit, like I kind of view things as like punk and alternative rock and indie and all that stuff. That's kind of my thing. But like, I think you still see it with like pretty much all live shows are like doing gangbusters these days, even though they're more expensive because people want to be outside.
Yeah.
They realize what they had missed. And there's so many young people kind of like making it for lost time, or they just need some more outlet for like the collective stress and worry that we all live with.
There's also in terms of New York City and real estate and all that coming out of the pandemic, New York right now, I think very, very tangibly feels transitional. Mm-hmm. And what it's transitioning to is sort of unclear. But there are a couple major things that have either happened or are about to happen in the city because of the pandemic.
Right.
That are, and it's not directly music related, except in that it's going to facilitate music or not. But the first is that all of this office space is empty in Midtown and in the financial district. And because of coding, codes, like they can't necessarily convert those buildings to residences.
Right.
So you're going to have office space that just no one knows what to do with. That's one. The other thing is that because in part because of the moratorium on evictions during the pandemic, there's now a case that's about to make its way to the Supreme Court that is looking to make all rent control and rent stabilization in New York City illegal, which would have absolutely devastating effects, and nobody knows about it and nobody's talking about it. But what comes out of that, I mean, not to seem glib about it because it's going to be devastating. It's going to just screw so many people over. But between those two things, and then also the city just cracked down on Airbnbs. Mm-hmm. So you can't rent out a full apartment as an Airbnb anymore, which is great. That's like A+. There is going to be so much empty real estate in New York City. And it is not like, at a certain point, people are going to need to make money off of it. Mm-hmm. And it's well established at this point that the way that you turn an area around is with art and with music. So I think maybe this is overly optimistic of me, but I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that we might see a New York that looks a little bit more like it did in the 70s and 80s, all the other versions. Yeah. It's
like without getting too highfalutin and political about it, we see a distinct surge in labor unions and strikes these days. Like, hey, I support the UAW. I support the Writers Guild. I hope they all win. If we actually get some union victories in this country, maybe that could really help revive the middle class to an extent, and that therefore the arts. I'm hoping. But to go back to your joke, thing about the lofts, this isn't really a joke. If you think about it, surely somewhere there's some 20-something kid in the style, a young Todd P, if you will, who's trying to figure out, okay, so there's a basically abandoned office building in the Wall Street area. No one goes in because those people can all work from home. They're all bankers or coders. So like no one really needs the office anymore. How can I rent that out for Ethan to do punk shows? Like, could you imagine seeing a punk band and like a bunch of cubicles? That'd be fun.
It's happening.
Yeah, I'd go.
It's happening. They're having raves in these buildings now.
They should invite me. I want to go. That sounds fun.
I want to go too. But they are happening. Yeah, it's already on its way.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Invite me. I want to go.
That's hopeful. That's hopeful. Troy, are you still on the line? You had a question.
Yes, I am on the line. Can you hear and see me?
Hey, let's see it.
Good.
Yeah.
Great. Also from the Midwest here, from Kenosha, Wisconsin. Yes, that Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Cool.
A PhD student here. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I wanted to talk about MySpace in the context of breaking popular music acts. We've seen many articles from Billboard this year of executives crying that they can't break new acts outside of Olivia Rodrigo and maybe Ice Spice, who have had success. So I want to talk about would ask you to talk about how MySpace was such an effective tool in breaking pop acts such as Lady Gaga and others who were also in the New York scene. Right, there are video clips of Gaga performing and literally no applause, no reaction in the crowd, right? And how she was able to use MySpace effectively to kind of build her audience, and why we're just not seeing that translate today. And maybe the answer is there isn't a mainstream out there, right, for that to happen. But curious to hear your thoughts, and thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I read the article you're talking about, and I was like, this is very, very silly. These people, okay, here's how traditionally it tends to work. An artist back in the 60s through like up until 2000s, an artist kind of tour a lot. They develop their fan base on the road. They learn how to get actually good at what they're doing. And then they'll get enough attention that record label will snap them up and get them something, help like, get them a publicity department, make some videos, work with the producer. And that's usually how an artist would get big, but they had to develop their fan base on the road. And that still happens today all the time. We have already mentioned this chat, Zach Bryan. We've already mentioned Turnstile. King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard, even if you're not into like stoner rock, they're playing like huge venues these days, like, and they develop that fan base organically. The problem is like after so much of like music culture now can really be traced back to the stock market crash of 2008. What happened after that is record companies needed quick, easy hits right away. So there's not a lot of money for long-term artist development, which is really what, if you can make an artist, if you spend money long-term artist development and the artist can really find their natural fan base, they can tour and make albums for decades and still be like, have a back catalog that's lucrative. But that takes a lot of long-term investment and work. And record companies just didn't have the time for that. And these days they'll say, well, the return on investment, again, Barfy term, on music is so small these days with Spotify and this pitiful streaming royalties that they don't want to put a lot of money into developing artists long term. They just want that quick hit. I'm not being like some pop snob. I love Olivia Rodrigo, but it's just like they don't want to develop artists, and that's how you actually make an artist develop with a fan base. It's like a lot of long-term investment and making someone who like can really prove themselves on the road. Because social media is great, but long-term, artists find their audience on the road 9 times out of 10. And like we have TikTok these days, but any artist will tell you TikTok is really great for having a moment. TikTok is generally not very great at creating a career. Whereas MySpace didn't just give you like a moment. MySpace kind of like gave you, here's the artist, here's their general like vibe, here's their songs, etc. It didn't work for everyone. Plenty of MySpace bands did not have a lasting career, but enough did that there was something that I would say there was something to the MySpace approach. But definitely to your point about pop music, so many pop artists broke off of MySpace is because when MySpace started, like the punk and emo kids flocked there first, just because those kids were already message boards kids, they were LiveJournal kids, they were AOL Instant Messenger kids. But like as MySpace grew, like every music fan of all stripes just started using it more and more, especially after YouTube debuted and quickly supplanted MTV. So eventually MySpace was just for everyone, all genres of music. And Lady Gaga was smart enough to know that not only did she have great songs, but she had a look that was very distinctive, but also referenced enough things that are already prominent in the culture. You know, bringing together club music, but also like a theater kid, that theatricality. She was kind of goth, but didn't really make goth music, but she could still kind of appeal to those sort of people. In a way, like she was, because MySpace made it very easy for any one user to kind of curate their, again, brand, or like, this is who I am as a person. And Lady Gaga instinctively got that. And that's what made her like, when her time was ready, she had everything to go and just boom, blew up.
It also, your question just made me think, because you mentioned the kind of ending of, you know, maybe there not being a mainstream anymore or whatnot. You know, if one of the positives of MySpace was that it was helping artists find other artists who are, you know, coming from a similar place, that was also one of the negatives.
Yeah.
And that, you know, if you can find, like, if you can go online and immediately find 6 bands that sound like you, you're not going to make do with what's in your neighborhood. And
Right.
A lot of the stuff that I write about in the book, a lot of the incredible music that came out of New York City came out because people were being exposed to music that was not their music necessarily.
Yeah, 100%. That's the great thing. New York, you walk around, you'll be exposed to everything from hip hop to jazz to Latin music to punk to everything. Like people are blasting music on their speakers all the time. There's different venues for DJs, whatever. Like you'll get a very well-rounded musical education just by walking around. And being online, you can make the choice to narrow your listening habits to just what you already like, or you can check out whatever you want. But that's more on the listener and their own natural curiosity than the platform itself.
Well, the algorithms also encourage you to keep listening to things that are what you already like.
You know, if I were to say, there's so many things that made MySpace, I think, really special. A lot of it was because Tom Anderson truly was a music fan. Like his favorite band was Weezer. He was in a pop punk band called Swank that never went anywhere. And he really knew that music fandom would really be the fuel that would help MySpace take off. But it also helped that there was no algorithm. Everything that made the front page of MySpace was something someone on staff chose just because they liked it. It was, to use the buzz term, curated.
Well, this is a terrific conversation. I am going to have to wrap us up. Unfortunately, I'm afraid. Oh, I'm afraid we're going to get kicked off of our Zoom soon. But before we go, I just wanted to remind everybody that next week we'll be hearing Jonathan Leal, Dreams in Double Time on Race, Freedom, and Bebop, in conversation with Nate Sloan. And you can check our listserv and other spaces to get the link. We'll make sure, or email me if you'd like for the link. And just wanting to thank Jesse and Michael so much again for this terrific conversation.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for having us. Yeah.
Jesse, thank you for the great book. Thank you for talking to me.
And likewise, this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and Eric Weisbart, if you ever watch this, thank you so much for editing or co-editing the Spin Alternative Record Guide. It was very formative to me in my youth, as you can probably tell.
That's terrific. I'm sure he will get that message. Thanks.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. Oh, we should also check to see, are you all okay with us putting this up on YouTube?
Yep. And if you are in the New York area on October 5th, I'll be speaking with Billboard's Jason Lipschitz at Little City Books in Hoboken, New Jersey. Do come say hello.
I wish I could be there. Unfortunately, no.
Yeah.
But thank you all.
You're welcome. Hey, thanks for having us.
Francesca, you just want to push stop on the recording, eh?
All righty.